response to the recent executive orders by the White House on both WeChat and TikTok, do you think any board members at Tencent today are reflecting on the subject? Have you ever done any contingency plans at the boardrooms, you think, on the potential ban by the United States of these apps from operating in the market?
Chinese companies who have the international aspirations have really not well prepared for this kind of issues, meaning the geopolitical issues. Most of the Chinese companies, even many of that I work with, and leading Chinese companies who want to become globalized or at least internationalized, they have a very simple belief. They thought that, you know, if you have a good set of products, if you have a good brand, you set a good board and then good governance and maybe a good set of values, then you can go abroad. You can go anywhere, right? You can copycat your success model in China into other parts of the world. And maybe that was the case for American companies or Western multinational companies who, you know, try to went globalize from the Western markets to other parts of the market. But I think the other way may not be working out that smoothly, as we are now seeing with the issue of TikTok, and also with the you know the issue with the Tencent and WeChat. The Chinese companies are now learning very fast about the realities of the geopolitical interference and actually the harsh reality of geopolitics. And before, from what I know, because I work with a lot of Chinese companies, in particular in the tech area, you know, their public relations or government relations department are merely just compliance department. They just work on compliance, right?
So you're basically saying the Chinese does have very weak communications and PRs.
Well, it's not only that, it's the focus is on technical issues. You know, if a certain government or a certain jurisdiction have a certain requirement, then it's a compliance issue. I try to treat it as a technical issue. Very few of them, I would say, perhaps with the exception of Huawei, and maybe some of the SOEs like the oil and gas companies and so on, almost no Chinese company have any awareness that they need to have this capability of assessing and deal with political issues or geopolitical issues. And I think right now we're seeing that, you know, we're seeing with TikTok, with ByteDance, of course, you know, we're also seeing with WeChat and, you know, Tencent issues and how to respond, right? So
do you think that Huawei and ByteDance and Tencent should retaliate? Do you think they should be more reactive, responsive, aggressive in their, you know, dealings with the United States? Or do you think it's more of a cultural issue as well to keep this silent mode and laissez-faire attitude until, you know, enough is enough?
At the company level, as you know, it's pretty hard for a company or any company to take on a country, especially a country as strong as the USA, right? And so I think any company who want to really try to untangle some of this issue, we need to probably leverage the power of the government. And of course, as you know, the Chinese government has been behind Huawei quite a bit, actually, right? And so I think with Huawei, we're going in one direction. So far, we haven't seen very explicit statements or actions made by the Chinese government with respect to ByteDance or TikTok or WeChat or Tencent.
That's interesting. Sorry to interrupt you, Ed, because that's a really important point. You're saying that the Chinese government officially has not had any stance or statement in regards to these companies.
So far. I mean, there are some statements, meaning the foreign ministry have come out to say that, you know, the actions or decision by the US government is not appropriate, that's not right, and so on. But the Chinese government have not come back with specific measures in so-called retaliation or in response to the actions that USA already have taken with respect to this
Right.
company.
Back in 2019, if we remember correctly, when the US launched the unreliable entity list. And so Chinese Ministry of Commerce came out and said, we're going to have our own, we're preparing for our own unreliable entity list. And essentially that would seem very much as a retaliation of, equal weighting US companies in China. And so it's been 15 months now, and there has been waves of geopolitical escalations and sanctions against Chinese companies. Where is this entity list? What do you think are the calculations here?
My understanding is that the Chinese government have recognized the increasing importance of globalization and China being a major part of globalization, and that not only China would need to be an integral part of global supply chains for global companies, but also importantly, China ought to be an increasingly more important market for multinational companies as well. And so in the process, actually, instead of blocking or trying to create restrictions, more restrictions for foreign companies in China, the Chinese company has been relaxing, not in a perfect way. As you know, there's always haphazard, right? Sometimes it's better, sometimes not as good. But directionally, the Chinese government has been accelerating its opening with respect to market access to foreign companies in China and been very supportive, at least from a central government standpoint, right? For foreign companies to stay in China, to continue to invest in China and create increasingly a level playing field. Not every playing field is level yet, but the attempt is quite genuine.
How much of a say do you think that the Chinese central government has in terms of influencing, the messaging of ByteDance or Tencent when it comes to reacting to the United States? Do you think they really tell them you have to shut up and be quiet, really guiding them and giving them the strategy that they want?
Well, I'm not involved in that part, so I can't really comment. But ByteDance is a privately owned company. It's a 民营企业, and the owner, Mr. Zhang Yimin, is actually quite free-spirited. Of course, he's got his own mind. That's why he's so successful, right? He's very entrepreneurial and so on and so forth. And his relationship with the government is very unlike the relationship between the SOE and the government. So, I wonder how much sort of behind the scene directive that the government can actually give to, ByteDance. I don't actually think that there is a lot of room for the government to actually play in a way quite similar in the case of Tencent.
I also want to come back to the corporate space, particularly response from these companies involved. Say, for example, for Tencent boards and these Hong Kong listed company, they have very sophisticated board members in there. What were do these people, come back now and say, well, how have we missed this completely? What are their responses on behalf of the shareholders of the company currently? The company has been, as far as I understand, very quiet on the issue.
Yeah, I think right now these companies are still trying to understand what's happening and trying to figure out how to respond, because there are different potential responses and it's not just one way. At the same time, especially with the Tencent and WeChat case, as you know, there is a huge lobbying effort that's now going on in Washington by, I think, at least a dozen large American companies or something in that order, to try to explain or lobby to the Washington administration that, in fact, if you shut out WeChat, we're going to be in big problem, because we American companies are doing business through WeChat or with WeChat. Without WeChat, actually, we're going to be suffering big time, right? So there's still a lot of dynamic process that's going on. Not everything is not quiet down yet, So I think on the board, as I understand, right now there's both discussion and also a bit of a waiting out to see how things evolved. And so, you see this process of this period of apparent silence, but in fact, behind the scene, there's a lot of things happening.
When you talk to your Chinese corporate clients, how would you describe, the mood on the ground? Do they think, oh, let's wait until November the 3rd, US presidential elections, everything will get better? Do you feel that there is a sense of arrogance? We can do without US in the future anyways because we're such a huge population. What is the feeling?
In general, there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty, actually. I would say uncertainty.
Word, yeah.
Of course, people are waiting out to see what the result of the election is gonna be, but regardless whether or not it's gonna be a Republican victory or a Democratic victory, I think in general, the Chinese entrepreneurs don't believe that things is gonna change in a significant manner towards a better scenario in a short period of time. People believe that a reasonably challenging relationship between the U.S. and China will take on for some time and maybe a long time, right? And so, given that, some of the companies I talk to, especially in the tech space, they like to keep very low profile. They didn't want to sort of even raise any concerns from the U.S. They don't want to get out and then have the hammer.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want to really comment, want to really mention that. So for some other companies, they feel that it is what it is. It's the situation that as a corporation they can't really deal with by themselves. And it's a U.S.-China relationship at the national level. So there's a lot of this kind of waiting out. But I say in general, the sentiment is that this whole change has come very, very rapidly and very abruptly, and almost nobody was well prepared for this. And so it has caused a lot of surprises to a lot of the companies that I know.
So next, Ed, following your thoughts, there are more companies that are potentially being targeted by the U.S. government, and I think possibly even before the election. And so now Alibaba, I just saw the notice, Alibaba comes out and it says it's currently closely watching the global situation. Of course, Alibaba Cloud was actually highlighted in the Clean Network announcement as one of the targets, and also DJI. DJI yesterday, I think that was a little bit of a good news for them. But the company, nonetheless, like what you said, that it is out there. It sells to 76% of the U.S. market, and so what possibly can happen to these companies, you think?
Well, the worst case scenario is, of course, they would be treated like a TikTok or WeChat, right? Or even worse, Huawei, a ban or forced sale of the U.S. or non-China operations to a U.S. company or something, right? So everybody is, who is potentially included in this kind of list is very concerned about it. But as I said, mentioned earlier, people are now keeping sort of low profile. People who didn't want to come out and really openly comment or of course not criticize the Americans for potentially doing this, but they are aware of the challenges because what they've seen with TikTok and WeChat already.
I watched a very interesting video on YouTube the other day with Martin Schack, the China expert, and he basically said that one of the biggest risks is that the two countries could actually break the diplomatic relations. The US has recognized China in 1979, but with like the closure of the Houston consulate and then the repercussions in China, that this could be a real threat. And it's all about the US not recognizing the fact that China is going to be the next #1 superpower, but they should just come to terms, right? So do you think that this could be a real risk, and are actually companies that you talk to concerned about US and China, finishing their diplomatic relations before the elections?
There's a lot of talk about decoupling, technology decoupling. There's a lot of concerns about what's going to happen with TikTok and what's happening with WeChat, and of course with Huawei, with Zhou and all the stuff. And also in general, people are concerned about the general US-China relationship and potentially also perhaps some military skirmishes in the South China Sea, etc. Very, very few people that I talk to in China have any concern or any possibility, belief in the possibility that the diplomatic relationship between China and US will be out. Of course, there's a possibility. I mean, one cannot rule that out. But on the ground in China, I don't sense any major concern about that scenario to play out. Most people are concerned about, with this current very dramatic and very chaotic way of dealing with Chinese company, would that continue to go on? And I think most people actually are very concerned that that will continue to go on for a little while.
So let me, I want to go back to the tech space. It's ironic almost, on one hand, you're seeing Chinese companies being sanctioned, being under siege by the United States. But on the other hand, you're starting to see continued Chinese entrepreneurs' aspirations in getting listed in the United States. So just in the past 30, 40 days, we saw how many big gorillas has gone listing in the U.S. Market. We started with Xiaopeng, Alibaba back to Xiaopeng. We had Meituan back Li Auto. And then just a couple of weeks ago, we had Tencent back to KE Holdings. Tencent owns 11% of KE Holdings, and now KE post-IPO is sixth largest Chinese listed U.S. companies in terms of market cap. And so we've got all this series of Chinese companies that are going listing in the United States amidst all these sanctions and the potential restrictions and potential systemic delisting. What is the rationale there?
Well, the U.S. market, the U.S. capital market, especially the Nasdaq, is, as you know, the capital pool is large, and you had incredible liquidity and a lot of institutional investors running around, right? So these companies decided to come to the U.S. mainly because of those kind of reasons. As you also know, equally at the same time, we got Ant Financial or Ant Group, which are now targeted to come to Hong Kong and Shanghai, right? And we already had, with JD and NetEase and so on earlier, who were listed in, or relisted in Hong Kong, and Alibaba itself too, right? So I think you see both. You see both sides happening. You see some companies going to the US because of the pool size and also because of the liquidity. Some people come to Hong Kong, and maybe some also do listing in Hong Kong and Shanghai.
Right.
These markets also becoming quite significant in their own way. But then, Hong Kong and maybe Shanghai, perhaps in some cases, a little bit more safer, right? If you look at it from a risk standpoint.
So to which extent do you think, Ed, that the global geopolitical situation will dent their appetite to go global, not just to the US, but also to Europe? I mean, in the US, for example, Alibaba only gets about 7% of their global sales, right? So it's really not a huge market, and many of them will be insulated from any US or European attacks.
This is a topic that we talk a lot about in China with Chinese company with the international aspirations. I think the reality of the geopolitics that we're now seeing are really trying, are putting a damp on how the Chinese entrepreneurs are now thinking about going overseas and becoming globalized. Not that they are not willing to or don't want to go globalized. They are now becoming aware of the complexity and the challenges in going globalized, and they wanted to be more cautious about the whole thing. So, I would expect that in the next few years, that whole speed of globalization or internationalization from the Chinese companies will slow down, even for the biggest companies. Like, right now we're seeing ByteDance, They're meeting a lot of challenges. WeChat is meeting a lot of challenges. So other companies will face the same challenges too.
I suspect that this might be the biggest impact essentially on these very targeted policies from the US towards China. That is, it essentially destroyed the most vibrant part of Chinese private sector's aspirations in turning into major global companies, isn't it?
From the standpoint of internationalization, I think for now that is probably true. But from the standpoint of focusing on the domestic market, which, as you know, China has come up with the internal circulation strategy, right? Really focusing on the internal economy. Of course, not forgetting about the trade with the other countries, but the internal economy has become a major focus for the Chinese central government. And so for a lot of these tech companies, there will be a lot of room to grow within the China market. So I think for a little while, we're going to see more focus domestically with the China market and grow with the China market, while at the same time, I think people are taking a wait to see on how the geopolitical scene would evolve, especially after the November elections in the US. Situation, my personal view is that situation could become better come next year. Not right away, but over time it's going to become perhaps better. And then the confidence will come back. Because as you know, the Chinese entrepreneurs are very entrepreneurial. They have a lot of aspirations and they know how
Certainly have some of the best.
So,
and they will always find a way to come up with new technological innovations and ideas for sure. It might even boost competition and, creativity as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'm not too worried about that part, but right now, I think to be realistic, a lot of people would say, oh, let me go to the US and let me expand the US market right away and, be number one there. It doesn't happen so much.
Well, that is interesting because in terms of long-term planning, for China Standards 2035, China aspires to build the global technological standards for essentially the 21st century. And so if these companies don't go overseas, they become essentially, like what you said, they circulate within the Chinese domestic economy. Then how do you build global standards if you just practice essentially within the Chinese economy? That seems to be conflicting to me.
Yeah, I think over time, right now you look at it, there's certainly conflicts or, opposite momentum. But I think over time, things going to sort of sort it out. As I mentioned, the geopolitical context would probably evolve over time. It can remain like this forever. Things are going to have to come back because, the US and China actually share a lot of commonalities despite a lot of differences. There's a lot that the Chinese and the Americans can work together actually, but having to come closer together rather than going away, right? And
I believe the turning point will really be the United States accepting the fact that China is going to be the next, number one global economy. And then everything will be fine. It's just a matter of really coming to terms and realizing and accepting that.
I think, Martina, I think it's not as straightforward. I think it's very difficult for anyone to just say, oh, I accept this as a fact. I think it's going to be a process of a lot of communication, a lot of give and take. The Chinese probably need to adapt somehow in the way that they do things and also the style of how they do things. And of course, the Americans have also come their own ways and appreciate the rise of China more appropriately, right? So it requires more engagement, on a very constructive level, rather than a lot of shouting that's happening right now, right? I don't think that is healthy for us.
Sure. So Ed, talking about China responses and growing essentially, China's, I guess, the policy maturity along with its economic maturity. And so in the recent event, as we see as it unfolds, the U.S. Senior officials, four of them, right, Secretary of State Pompeo, National Security Advisor O'Brien, FBI Director Chris Wray, and then you got Attorney General Barr, who have come out in a series to define the most important central issue as they see it in the 21st century, which is its response to China. And I think those speeches were fantastically laid out. It's very clear cut. It does show that the government at various layers have done all their homeworks, and they really have defined their strategy, their, I would say, even grand strategy. But on the Chinese side, we seems that everything has been reactionary. And that seems to be the general perception when the U.S. closed the consulate, China reciprocally closed the consulate as well, and some other things. And so when is China going to come out in a proactive way to define the 21st century relationship between China and the world, and in particular, China with the United States? Does China at some point come out and say, hey, China's got a definition of the world as well?
China in the driving seat, yeah.
It's a very good observation. I think the Chinese, throughout this whole process of Donald Trump becoming the president and Donald Trump initiating the trade dispute and the trade war, and then from the trade war to, as you said, the Pompeo and the other three person, I think you call them the four herdsmen or something, right? Shirley?
Yeah, the four horsemen. Yeah,
well, horsemen,
actually not so. Well, that was Bannon's line. I thought it was cute, but not since yesterday, since he's been in so much trouble.
Right. So the four horsemen speech, I mean, it signifies a very different. It's a change to what the trade war was, right? The trade war simply is a trade discussion. It's about tariffs. But the Pompeo and the other three speeches were becoming more ideologically driven, right? They were
more strategic in a way.
More strategic and more ideological, and they're focusing on the Chinese Communist Party, right? And so you can see a shift in the strategic focus of what the administration wanted to do. As far as the Chinese response, I think the Chinese were also learning along the way. Frankly, my own observation is that when Donald Trump won the presidency, the Chinese didn't quite know who Donald Trump was. And there's a lot of speculation on how he would become a president and so on and so forth, right? And then along the way, actually, when Donald Trump began to do certain things, I think a lot of people, including the Chinese, were quite surprised by how drastic and how fast he did his own thing, and therefore how the Chinese had to react to that, right? And I think this process has been accelerating in the last few months, right? As the topic of discussion went from trade war to pandemic, condemning or blaming China for the pandemic, and now to ideological divide and so on and so forth. It evolved. I think the Chinese government is actually also learning along the way, and they were somewhat surprised by how the US administration has been taking this so fast and so, in a way, so abruptly, right? And so I think in terms of the response, my understanding is that the Chinese government has decided, or maybe now, instead of being just pure tit for tat, they need to do tit for tat for specific events like closing of the embassy or whatever, right? But in terms of this general strategy, I think they are now sort of waiting or wanting to have a more fixated and more firm strategy before they release that, right? And so some of this is waiting. But at the same time, Shirley, as you know very well, China is not that they don't have a strategy. They do have a strategy, and the strategy from President Xi was always been the embracement of globalization, the embracement of multilateralism, and the manifestation of what he called a shared a community of humanity, which or something like that, right? That is his vision, and that's his strategy. And as far as I know, that is still the pivot of the strategy. despite what the US is now doing.
Mm. So in terms of global capital mobility, it's interesting FDI in the first half of the year has gone up year over year from 2019 levels. And of course, the second quarter, it has recovered quite a lot.
Yeah.
I saw reports out in this area as well. So on one hand, we saw from U.S.-China Committee of National Relations, U.S.-China National Committee of USCR, I don't,
Yes,
national.
yeah.
So
Sure.
anyway, this U.S. Organization, they yesterday issued a report saying the 70+% of American companies they surveyed have insisted that they want to stay in China. And I thought that was very encouraging news. But at the same time, from Chamber of Commerce, there are reports that saying quite a large percentage of American companies are trying to leave China. And so what is the real sense in China, you think, today in terms of foreign direct investment? Do you see companies actually leaving? What is the more dominant trend or company coming in?
My personal interactions with a large number of multinational American companies actually is that almost everyone wanted to stay in China. Or some of them are really committed to double down further because they look at it. In fact, for quite a number of them, China is probably the only market in the world where they're making money, especially since the pandemic. In China is the rest of the pandemic, in the rest of the world is still going on, right? And so the importance of China is clear. What's happening also is that many large multinational companies, American companies included, they actually have multiple business lines or multiple business units. So it's not just about one business. So you have multiple business, in certain industrial areas, some are maybe in some components, some are maybe in pharmaceuticals and whatever, right? And then the performance of different business lines could vary in some cases because of different reasons, not only because of the industry or the market, but also because of your competitiveness or your capabilities. So in a multiple business unit kind of companies, some of the business units are doing well in China and they want to double down. Perhaps there may be a small number who's not doing so well. They're being very marginalized and the pandemic actually squeezed their economics and they had to decide to leave or close down or downsize their operations. So you could have both things happening at the same time. So both can be right, but in general, the feelings that I get, and I talk, of course, to the trade association quite a bit as well. In general, the mood is still, a good mood from foreign companies or American companies in China, but the concerns are still very much there. The concerns about the U.S.-China relationship, about, they understand China, central government of Beijing is committed to more opening and so reform, but they are unsure about the local governments, whether local governments actually can equally implement the central government's policies, right? Because as you know, a lot, the real happenings happening in the local level, right? Beijing can only give the directions, right? So they're concerned about these kind of issues, and they're concerned very much about whether or not they can compete in China, because the Chinese competitive landscape for many businesses are extremely competitive. It's because of anything. It's because it's the largest market. You got a lot of different players. You got the traditional multinationals, you got the SOEs, and then you also get a lot of Chinese startups, right? The entrepreneurial companies who can be very, very competitive. And so a lot of the foreign companies have to learn about how to compete in China, even though they may be very successful for the last 20 years. But that's past success doesn't guarantee you can be successful in the future because things are changing, right? So that's the feeling that I get, talking and working with a larger number of companies here on the ground. So I think your references are both correct, at least the way that I read it. But the mood is a cautiously optimistic mood here in China for the multinationals.
Cautious optimism.
Yeah.
Fascinating insight as always, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.